Okay. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the Vancouver Ions Community Group. And our speaker tonight is, I'm very excited to have Chris Bache, PhD, back to talk about another of his areas of contemplation, which he wrote about in his book, Life Cycles, A Study of Reincarnation. Reincarnation is a topic that I'm sure people have different ideas about, either believing, disbelieving, or curious. Based on my own contemplation in my younger years and subsequent personal experiences, including a past life regression in my 20s, I'm in the believer camp. Chris, who was our speaker a couple of years ago, was just wonderful. And as we've said in our check-ins, that a lot of people have read his book and been very appreciative of the work that he did and the work that he wrote about. Chris is a professor emeritus in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Youngstown State University, where he taught for 33 years. He's also adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies, emeritus fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, on the board of the Groff Legacy Training. An award-winning teacher and international speaker, Chris has written 4 books, Life Cycles, about reincarnation, Dark Night, Early Dawn, about pioneering work in psychedelic philosophy, The Living Classroom, an exploration of collective fields of consciousness, In Teaching, and LSD in the Mind of the Universe, the story of his 20-year journey with LSD, which is a fabulous book. Chris lives in Weaverville, North Carolina, with his wife, Christina Hardy, a professional astrologer and past life therapist. So Chris, take it away. And thank you for being here.
Hi, everybody. Sure is nice to see you, and thank you for all of your warm greetings. They really touched my heart. And I hope we have a lot of fun today. I'm looking forward today. And because many of you know my work, I just want to show you something which I think you'd like to see. You know, in 2008, I wrote The Living Classroom. I talked about fields of consciousness, the transmission, energetic transmission. I never mentioned psychedelics. I didn't mention anything about my psychedelic work. Now, SUNY is bringing out that book in a new edition. So this is the new edition just out this coming month. And it's expensive in hardback, but ebook, it's out in ebook, and it'll be in paperback in a year. This is the true edition of The Living Classroom. This time they gave me permission to talk about psychedelics. So this time I'm actually saying, I was a university professor for 20 years. I was taking these large doses of LSD in a therapeutic setting. And this is what happened with my students. And this is the theory of classrooms and fields of consciousness that came out of it. So just to share that with you, because this is a special joy, and it kind of deepens puts the final stitch into bringing back together the 2 halves of my life that I had to separate in order to do the psychedelic work, in order to stay a university professor in the world. But to do this work, I had to let them separate. Now they're coming back together again late in my life. But before I published in psychedelics, I tackled what I thought was really a really important fundamental question dividing world philosophies, and that is reincarnation. If you believe this is the only life we got, you're going to go down a certain direction. If you believe we have multiple lifetimes, you're going to go down a different direction. Seemed to be a fundamental thing. And the amazing thing is, after I got out of graduate school and after I started teaching and I started to read around more, I found that we had an amazing body of evidence that documents that this is a true and legitimate part of life. None of my graduate courses had taken reincarnation seriously. You know, not the Western religions that I had studied, not the scientific traditions that had displaced those traditions in my mind. And here was Ian Stevenson at University of Virginia, proving that reincarnation is a fact of life. I had to erase my entire intellectual blackboard and start over again. Because if reincarnation is a fact of nature, then we're living in a much different universe than I had thought we were living in before. So my entire life has kind of been unfolding an understanding of what it's like. Just like we see plate tectonics now, and we see galaxies giving birth to stars, and we see planets terraforming. Now there is this understanding that reincarnation is part of how nature has carried forward and advanced the learning of individuals within certain species. Up to that point in time, evolution is carrying forward the learning of entire groups forward into more groups and more groups. But eventually there reaches a point where individuality matures and nature has found a way to fold individual learning forward into cascading accumulations of knowledge and wisdom and experience. Okay, so my first sabbatical, I wrote life cycles, and it starts with a chapter on the evidence for reincarnation. And then it goes on to look at, say, so what? If reincarnation is true, what does it say about our relationships? What does it say about family? What does it say about larger patterns? So what I'd like to do tonight is share with you this lecture on gathering together the scientific evidence for reincarnation. Now, it turns out I gave a good lecture on this topic at an European gathering, World Congress on Consciousness, and it's 35 minutes long. So what I'd like to do is play that and let that carry the water for taking you through the evidence. I can't say it better than I said it here. And I was younger, had more energy, was a stage, and it worked well. And then after 35 minutes, I'll catch it, finish it out, and then we've got all the time remaining for question and answers, okay? All right, so let's hope the technology gods are with us. Fingers crossed, everybody. All right. I hope you're seeing what I'm seeing, which is, all right, large screen. And I hope the sound works.
There we go. Okay.
Okay. Now, if I can make this.
If the most important philosophical question one can ask in life is, do we survive the death of our body? Which Dr. Van Lommel is asking. I think the second most important question is, do we live once or do we live more than once? And it all hinges on time, the problem, the significances of time. As a teacher, if I give a quiz, I have a right to expect a certain performance from the students. If I give an hour exam, I have a right to expect a higher level of performance. And if I give a take-home research paper, I expect a higher level of performance because they have more time. If this universe, if this magnificent universe that we are in has a purpose, then as a philosopher, we have to measure the purpose of the universe proportionate to the time we have to fulfill that purpose. If we only live one time, then we might extrapolate or estimate or calculate the purpose of existence to be. But if we live 100 times, if we live 1,000 times, if we live 10,000 times, if our participation in this magnificent universe is truly open-ended, then we have a very different relationship with the universe, and then we have a reason to think about the possible purpose of existence in a completely different framework. And the religions of the last 4,000 years have had a tendency to not value physical existence. They've had a tendency to say, well, you achieve realization, you achieve enlightenment, and then you leave. Nirvana. Samsara, you escape samsara. Moksha, escape. Or you achieve salvation, and then you leave. But that leaves the fundamental question, what is the purpose of the universe? Unanswered. What is the purpose of my physical existence in the universe? But if we come back to this life many times, then we have a different story that begins to unfold. And it doesn't, I think our understanding of reincarnation is completely incomplete at this point. Just as we've begun to understand the true depth and breadth of the universe that we are part of, likewise, when we begin to understand that we participate, we're dancing with this universe for extended period of time, then we have a deeper understanding of what the universe might actually be trying to accomplish in us and what might be our gift to the universe in the continual refinement and compounding of our talent over time. So what I'd like to do today is talk about the evidence for reincarnation. And I've been thinking about this and been in this game for a long time. The first book I wrote, is Life Cycles. And notice how long ago I wrote it. It was the first book I wrote as an academic, and that is a signal of how important I think this topic is, and that there is good critical empirical evidence that allows us to decide this topic. If there weren't critical evidence, then it would just be a wasted exercise. And I think this evidence did not exist 50 years ago. And the theologians used to debate about reincarnation, go round and round. But today we have a different body of empirical evidence on reincarnation that has moved the topic from the theologian's table to the psychologist's table, to the philosopher's table, to the psychiatrist's table. And that's what I'd like to take you through some today. Now, when looking at the evidence for reincarnation, we can either go small or go large. We either look at the detailed cases or we look at the larger body of literature. The beauty and the real joy is in the detailed cases. But in 45 minutes, I've chosen to go large. What I would really like to do is encourage you today to read one book on reincarnation that you haven't read yet. And so I want to take you into some of the literature on reincarnation and show you some of the patterns that are emerging in the literature and rebirth. Okay? Ready to go? Let's go. 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation by Ian Stevenson. This is a book that changed my life because, like many people, when I finished graduate school in 1978, I was an atheistically inclined agnostic. I was trained in philosophy of religion, but all that training basically made me an atheist. But when I encountered this book, right after finishing graduate school, he turned my life around because he convinced me that there was evidence that we live on life more than once. He is the, okay. Oh, good. Stevenson is the Carlson professor, was the Carlson professor from the University of Virginia between 1967 and 2001. He has written 11 books on reincarnation. Some of the most important are these. Cases of Reincarnation Type, written over a 7-year period from 73 to 84. Unlearned languages by children, about children who have an ability to speak a language which no one in their family speaks, no one in their entire town speaks, sometimes an ancient language. Children who remember previous lives. And his last book, his magnum opus, a 1,000-page, 2-volume work, a study of 187 cases of children who not only have detailed memories of their immediate life, but actually carry the scars in their body which relate to the death wounds of the body in their previous personality. And that, of course, really upsets academics. I mean, it's one thing to have continuity of memory, that's bad enough. But to suggest that a wound of death can actually be transferred into the physical body of a subsequent personality, that drives my colleagues right up a wall. But 187 cases, well-documented case histories. It's a magnificent book. What are we looking at with Stevenson? We're looking at cases of children from around the world who have detailed recall of their most immediate recent life. They know their way around towns that they've never been in before. They can recognize persons when they're brought into the life place of the previous personality. They can recognize persons that they have never met before. They know the personal history, their personal history with that person. They had the appropriate emotional responses with that person. Husbands for wives, children. You have cases of a 5-year-old child who is showing all the feelings of the husband of a 35-year-old woman with all the emotional responses. There was one case of a child called Parmid. When he was reunited with the family of the previous personality, he was very shy around the wife of the previous personality. He wouldn't identify her until she left the room, but then he identified her. And then later he took her aside and he said two things to her. He said, "I've come, but you've not fixed bindi," which is the spot that Indian women wear on their forehead as an indication that they're married. And he also criticized her for wearing a white sari instead of a colorful sari. And the tradition in India is when you become a widow, you don't wear color for the rest of your life, you wear only white. Essentially, this 5-year-old boy was saying to this 35-year-old woman, "I've come, but you're acting like you're not married." They know the inner architecture of homes that they've never been in. They know people who owed them money when they died and the debt had not been collected. In one case, this little child was brought back to the home of the previous personality, and the wife of the previous personality said, "Okay, if you're my husband, where did you put the will? We couldn't find the will." The little boy walked over to a floorboard in the kitchen, pulled up the floorboard, and pulled the will out of this little secret place that only he knew about in the floor of the kitchen. Cases like that drive my philosophical colleagues at the university right up a wall. They don't know what to do with it. It's hard for them to deny it, but there it is. Some patterns in the data. The average time interval between the death of the first personality and the birth of the second personality, Stevens finds, about 2.5 years. The average distance between the life place of the first personality and the life place of the second personality, 50 miles. And these children tend to lose their memories around 8 years old. When they begin to get into school and in a more complex social environment, they basically forget, they lose their memory. So we're looking at a small time window from research from about 3 years old to 8 years old, a 5-minute time window to get to these children and document their memories. The remaining 90% forget them by the time they're 8. The remaining 10%, the vast majority of those forget them when they hit puberty. When they hit puberty, all hell breaks loose and they forget their subtle traces of their former lives. Stevenson asked, why do these children remember what most of us forget? And his answer is, he doesn't know. We need more research. It's all research. He has a hypothesis. He points out that about 60% of these children died violently in their previous life. The remaining 40% died either early, suddenly, or with an acute sense of unfinished business, like a mother who dies shortly after the birth of her baby. His hypothesis is maybe there's something about the trauma of being wrenched from life violently, suddenly, with an acute sense of unfinished business that encodes the consciousness in a way that draws them back faster than usual and closer than usual, because this time, I don't have time to give all the evidence, but this 2.5 years, 50 miles is faster than the population at large and closer to home than the population at large. In reviewing 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, the Journal of American Medical Association wrote, Stevenson has painstakingly and unemotionally collected a detailed series of cases in which the evidence for reincarnation is difficult to understand on other grounds. 2 years later, the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, a major psychiatric journal in the United States, published an entire journal devoted to Stevenson's cases, and it was such an unusual move that they published an editorial to justify or to explain their rationale. And in the editorial, they wrote, "Our decision to publish this material recognizes the legitimacy of his research methods and the conformity of his reasoning to the usual canons of rational thought." That's the way an academic qualifies their endorsement. Now, the philosophical institution, the guardians of orthodoxy, are not going to let Stevenson get away with this, not without a fight. And he has had his critics, and the most important critic is a man named Paul Edwards. And I promise you, this is the best picture I could find of Paul Edwards online. His book, Reincarnation, A Critical Examination. Paul Edwards was a major American philosopher. He taught at the New School for Social Research. He's best known for having been the editor-in-chief of the 8-volume Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So he's a major heavyweight in the philosophical tradition. He wrote a series of articles in 1986 to 87, a 4-part article on reincarnation, and eventually he published these articles in a later form in this book, Reincarnation. And he is the harshest critic of Stevenson. He accuses Stevenson of fraud. He accuses Stevenson of not being sufficiently rigorous in his analysis of the data. He accuses Stevenson of not actually verifying that he thinks that there could have been contact between the two families, that Stevenson isn't really critical in proving that these families, the first and second personality, have never had contact. But there's actually a deeper, to accuse someone of bad research and to prove bad research, two different things. And if you go through Stevenson's arguments very carefully, Edwards' arguments very carefully, you see that there's kind of a deeper logic operating in his work. He says reincarnation would represent a crucifixion of our understanding. And by our understanding, he means secular humanism, the philosophical scientific tradition, the Newtonian Cartesian philosophical tradition. He says, if you believe in reincarnation, you must accept what he calls 6 collateral assumptions. And these collateral assumptions are that materialism is false, that mind is not reducible to brain, that our identity is more than our personality, that there is a domain other than space-time, that death is an illusion, that there may be a deeper logic to our lives. Edwards says, these assumptions are surely fantastic, if not indeed nonsense. And even in the absence of a demonstration of specific flaws, a rational person will conclude either that Stevenson's reports are seriously defective or that his alleged facts can be explained without bringing in reincarnation. Well, I won't go over Edwards' arguments more carefully because Robert Almader has done this for us. Robert Almader is another major American philosopher. He is professor emeritus at Georgia State University. He has authored or co-authored 24 books. He wrote this book in which he is evaluating 5 categories of evidence for survival of death. The major analysis he's doing in this book is the debate between Stevenson and Edwards. And what he shows by analyzing Edwards' argument is that Edwards does not refute Stevenson's argument. What he does is refuse to even look at it seriously because he is so convinced that it must be false. He says that his argument constitutes a blatant bit of question begging, because he always assumes precisely what is in contention. What is in contention is, can consciousness exist without a brain? And because he believes that science has proven that consciousness can exist without a brain, therefore, we know that there must be something wrong with the evidence. Almeida says, if you have a very commanding argument that you cannot refute, then not to accept the argument is to act irrationally. Stevenson's tradition continues, even though he's passed on. He's now looking from the bleacher seats, watching us from there. This book by Tom Schroeder, Old Souls. Tom Schroeder definitely wins for having the award for having the worst cover of any book in reincarnation research. But Tom Schroeder is an interesting guy. He's a reporter. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. He's also one of the editors for the Washington Post, a major American newspaper. And he was interested in whether Stevenson's research could stand up to a critical reporter's eye. So he went with Stevenson on one of his trips around the world studying these small children. He looked over his shoulder and he came away convinced, as the subtitle shows, compelling evidence from children who remember past lives, convinced that Stevenson's methods were good, the data would stand up, these children were real. This is a compelling case for reincarnation. And at the University of Virginia, Stevenson's work continues in the person of Jim Tucker, who has now inherited Stevenson's chair. This book is a wonderful book. It's very much in the Stevenson tradition, continuing to look in detail, the detailed cases, and explaining why these cases cannot be attributed to weaker hypotheses like super psi or something like this. I might mention that Jim Tucker's book is a lot easier to read than Stevenson's book. Stevenson writes and thinks like a lawyer. It's very good, but it's very, very detailed, very dry. Jim Tucker brings a little more life to the subject matter. Now, everything we've been looking at so far has to do with what I would call the evidence from spontaneous memories, just children who spontaneously have memories of previous life. But there's another body of evidence. You have to approach it with a different framework. It's evoked memories, memories which have been evoked in some way. Different techniques, even massage can evoke a former life memory. But the most common one that we're familiar with is hypnotherapy, some type of hypnosis. The following books are representative titles of people who have worked in the field of past life therapy. My favorite book, written by a single therapist who has worked in the area of past life therapy and has thought about it a great deal, is this book by Roger Woolger. Notice the date, an earlier book. Other Lives, Other Selves. Started as a Jungian, ended up in past life therapy, doing past life's work. Even though Carl Jung, I don't know whether you probably know, he himself believed in reincarnation towards the latter years of his life, but he kind of kept it quiet. This is a wonderful book, intellectually totally competent, a wonderful review of detailed cases and a discussion of the implications of these cases. Past life therapy began to really explode in the 70s, 80s, and there were a lot of therapists who were concerned that there was not a graduate school, there was no curriculum, there was no agreed upon curriculum for how to establish the credentials for people who wanted to do past life therapy. And this task was taken on by Winifred Lucas, who wrote a magnificent 2-volume anthology, which is a compendium of essays and articles of the best of the people working at that time in past life therapy. So if you wanted to read a single book, I would read Woolger's book by one author. But if you wanted to see an overview of multiple people writing in the field, I would go to Winifred Lucas's book, Regression Therapy, a handbook for professionals. Carol Bowman was a social worker. She wasn't interested in past life therapy. She got into it because her son started having nightmares. He started waking up with very disturbing nightmares. And she approached him, she tried to work with him, took him to therapists, tried to do conventional things, but it didn't work. And then she began to do her homework. She began to look into past life therapy. She began to learn the field, and she began to help her own child solve his own trauma carried over from a previous life that was spontaneously bubbling up in his life. She began to attract other people with other children who were also having problems. And eventually she wrote this beautiful book, specifically a therapeutic book for parents who have children who are having traumatic memories surface that they're having difficulty dealing with. It was very successful, very persuasive. It really had a lot of impact. She got more business coming in. She wrote a second book. She gets the award for the second worst title, cover on Reincarnation book, Return from Heaven. She's looking specifically at relatives who have been reincarnated within their own families. Now, as a philosopher, that's a weaker body of evidence, right? Because there's so much potential for contamination if you're remembering your grandfather. Right? But as a father, this is interesting. It's interesting because reincarnation simply doesn't happen where it works well for the researchers across great distances and great families, but inside families is a very common occurrence, and therefore it deserves to be looked at. And next, Michael Newton. Two wonderful books, and I must confess a special partiality. If you want to read if you wanted to just pick out one or two books out of this entire list, I can't help but wish that you would read Michael Newton's work. Michael Newton was a hypnotherapist who got into past life therapy and was doing past life therapy. And then he accidentally discovered that his clients in deep hypnosis had the ability not only to remember their previous life, but to remember what happened to them after they died. They could remember, basically, his clients were beginning to describe the afterlife. And he didn't think this was possible. But he followed his clients, a good therapist that he is, and he took hundreds of people into deep hypnotic regressions, and he followed them when they would go through their former life and they would go through the death experience. He would follow them into their memories continuing on, and then he would ask them questions. And he kept detailed notes. He would ask questions about what was this, what was going on, what was it like? And what he found was, regardless of what background people came from, whatever their cultural enculturation was, fundamentalist Baptist, Karl Marxist, atheist, hardcore scientific reductionist, whatever their background was, people were describing the same fundamental reality in the after-death state. They were describing a world that had order, that had structure, that had logic. There was actually a social structure. It was a world in which older learners taught younger learners. And it was also a world where people made the choice to reincarnate as a conscious, careful decision. It's one of the most important choices you make. If you go to college, what courses you sign up for, that's an important choice, because once you sign up for a course, you're committed for the entire semester. When you incarnate, what life you take on is an important choice. And Michael Newton found that, in fact, in the spiritual world, the choice of what life to take is a consciously taken choice made under the guidance of your spiritual helpers and made in cooperation with the other persons that you're going to be incarnating with. So before we were born, when we knew more than we know now, when we were aware of more than we are aware now, we chose the life that we are living now. That fact alone just bears deep meditation. Two last examples, not from professionals, they're from amateurs, but that's what makes them interesting. The first is this book, Looking for Carol Beckwith. And what makes it interesting is the man who wrote it, Robert Snow. Because Robert Snow is the commander of the homicide division of the Indianapolis Police Department. All right, so he's chief of detectives he investigates murders. his opinion is very important. It must stand up in court. He would be the last person that you would think would be doing research on a former life. But it happened that he did a hypnotic session, not oriented towards past lives. He just kind of on a lark, he did a hypnotic session. And in this hypnotic session, he was hit in the face with a life that appeared to be his life, but it scared him to death. And he literally ran out of the room. But he was curious. And so he brought all of his detective skills to the systematic search to see if he could identify and track down whether there was such a person. And the story of his experience and the story of his detective work is told in this short book, Looking for Carol Beckwith. And lastly, this book, Soul Survivor, which you may have seen it because they did some news clips, decent news clips on it, written by Bruce and Andrea Leininger about their son, James. And this is a case of a child, 3 years old, 2 years old, who started having spontaneous memories and trauma, waking up crying in the middle of the night. Spontaneous memories of apparently dying in World War II as an airplane pilot over the coast of Japan. And his father was a fundamentalist Baptist, and he was absolutely vehemently opposed to his son reincarnating. Mother was a little more receptive. So they got involved in, first they wanted to help their son, but he got involved in the inquiry because he wanted to disprove reincarnation. Whatever was going on with James, he wanted to disprove reincarnation to protect his faith. In the end, they tracked down this pilot, they tracked down this story. They were able to reunite James with the people at a military reunion with the people who had served with this pilot, and James was able to identify people out of this group. The father became convinced that, in fact, his son was a reincarnation of this pilot, and reincarnation is true. Now, I'd like to just finish with two observations, quick observations, as lunch awaits. I'd like to emphasize what we don't know about reincarnation. The evidence for reincarnation may be compelling. However, we don't really know a lot about how reincarnation takes place or what the physics of rebirth is. We're still beginners in this. At this point, we can't say what the soul is or what it's made of. How does it come and go from the physical body? How does it interface with our biology and our genetic makeup? How does it encode its previous learning into our present body? And how does it leave with its learning intact after we die? These things right now are beyond our present grasp. I'm sure we'll make progress in the future, but before we do, we're going to have to stop reducing mind to brain, and we're going to have to approach this research with a more multidimensional metaphysical cosmology. And lastly, I'd like to point to a certain paradox in the evidence. And to do this paradox, I need to really go back to Ian Stevenson. Stevenson's evidence, I think, is the most powerful evidence for reincarnation. And his evidence liberates our thinking at one level, but it also constricts our thinking at another. Because the strongest evidence for reincarnation comes from lives that show the tightest connection, the tightest correlation. But the correlation can be so tight, it can lead, if you just study Stevenson's evidence, it can lead to anemic, an underdeveloped vision of what life is like when we die, when most of us die. And in that respect, we must remember that Stevenson's cases are not typical cases. These children are coming back very fast and very close to home. Most people spend much more, quote, time in the timeless condition of the spirit world. They have a much wider breadth of experiences. So Stevenson's evidence liberates us to thinking about the soul and thinking about our lives and thinking about our existence in a much larger expanded framework. But in order to actually fill in that canvas, in order to actually explore more deeply what happens to us when we die and what the larger circle of life is like, from expanded consciousness to contracted consciousness and back into expanded consciousness, we need to look at other bodies of data. I think Michael Newton's work is an important body of data that gives us a larger vision. And this afternoon, when I talk about psychedelic research, I'll look at another body of data, which I think can give us an expanded vision of our life in this universe. Thank you very much.
Okay, that brings us back. It brings us back.
Excellent.
I sure had fun sharing this with you. It brings back a lot of memories for me. I had a good time with this group of people giving this material. And now you have to picture yourself, we've just finished this talk. I'm walking around on stage with a microphone, waiting for the questions or contributions you'd like to make in the wake of this presentation. I will just say that my thinking of reincarnation has evolved beyond where it was when I wrote Life Cycles. I opened up a deeper level of reincarnation thinking in Dark Night, Early Dawn, when I began to bring in the psychedelic experience. And then in LSD and the Mind of the Universe, I give the most complete, expanded understanding of reincarnation with the birth of the diamond soul, with the concept of the birth of the diamond soul in history. So, but where it all begins is, do we have good evidence? Do we have good, reliable evidence that any good, hard-nosed skeptic should endorse, whether or not they do or not? So that's some of the literature, and Dottie has a core bibliography that she's gonna hopefully send out to everybody afterwards. So all the names and places and books that I mentioned are there, plus more. So you'll get those. So now the floor is open.
So if you'd like to ask a question, use the little hand raise thing down at the bottom. Let's see, which one is it? React. And raise your hand and we'll call on you. Victoria, you're the first.
Wow, that was very lovely. And you actually answered one of my questions, was how has your understanding evolved? But the two questions, you talk about species reincarnation, which I'd love to hear more about that, especially given our current situation. And I also would like to understand more what you mean when you talk in the book about purification and detoxification, because that also seems very relevant. And what does that mean for us individually and collectively?
Yeah. Well, when I began my psychedelic work, I thought it was about personal transformation, personal, even maybe personal enlightenment if I got lucky. But then, of course, what happened is that I dissolved, the method I was using was so powerful, it dissolved me so deeply into collective consciousness and the collective species mind, again and again and again, that it began to activate dynamics at a species level. And one of the very powerful ones way down the road was actually experiencing, it was like I was in deep space and I was experiencing the pulse of life on our planet. And it was a pulse that kind of pulsed every 100 years, more or less, but it was a pulse of reincarnation. And I was experiencing all of human beings as cells in a superorganism. And this superorganism was evolving itself through their individual life task. It was the most magnificent thing, and it was beautiful, but it deepened my sense that everything we're doing is part of a larger collective dynamic, an evolutionary dynamic. Everything we're doing is, what we think of as a private is not private. Everything is wired into a collective network. And that's true of reincarnation in general, and then in specific things about when I went into the ocean of suffering. The things we get involved in deep spiritual work, some of it's our personal, some of it's former life, some of it's not personal at all. Some of it's just, it's larger, cleaning the bayou. Now, we know from studying mystical autobiographies, when an individual is opening to deeper, pure, more comprehensive, unitive states of consciousness, those states of consciousness are incredibly powerful and pure, and they tend to churn up the psyche and bring to the surface all the things that are distorting their natural ability to enter into this awareness. So all the bruises and all the cheaty little things and all the little sneaky little things and whatever that kind of mucking us up comes to the surface. Well, if that's, and then we process them. And as we process them, we clear them out, we let them go. And then our whole psychic system gets cleaner and cleaner. And we're able to not only heal, but to go into deeper spiritual states of awareness. So we know mystics do this. We know meditators do this. We know people in psychotherapy do this. Turns out that this is also true for the entire species. The entire species carries the wounds of its history in its collective memory banks. The entire species has lived all these years of war, has died in all these terrible deaths of plague, have all the mothers who have died in childbirth. Anything which isn't processed out by the present or future life of that soul stream is still in this collective psyche. And it still holds humanity's back, if you will. It still scares humanity. It still keeps us focused. And if humanity is, as I think it is, in the process of growing up into a deeper existential level of awareness, it has to offload all these things which are keeping it small, which means it has to purify itself, sweat out all all their pain that we're carrying as a collective, all the pain and suffering, all the vicious wounding of other beings. This is coming to the surface in us collectively, and as well as individually. And if you begin to look like that, then there are certain things that you can see happening in a culture which seem to be maybe less as we had thought of them before, as a lot of individuals manifesting this thing, and kind of more as the pulse of a deeper process. So I think we are entering a time in history of exponential growth. But exponential growth, watch out. It requires exponential purification, exponential detoxification. But this is simply how complex systems evolve themselves, how we grow. So it's a very exciting time, very challenging time, time of exponential growth. But for that same reason, time that calls on the warrior within us, the warrioress within us, going to be hard times. Yeah.
Well, just briefly, well, I imagine it can be brief. So for me, this brings up so much emotion. It feels like patriarchy needs to be within, needs to be let go of, and that seems huge. It feels like you kind of alluded to the wrong leaders. Who knows? But it feels like it's being brought up. And so can you just give an example of what does that mean? That because that's huge, but minute to minute, or what does that mean to do?
We just went through this election. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm in a safe room, but if I step on people's political toes, I apologize. But we had a choice between a man and a woman, and a particular kind of man with a particular worldview, and a woman with a particular kind of woman, a particular worldview. And collectively, we chose, I think, the worst of the choice. We chose regressively. We chose looking backwards. we chose trying to hold on to what we had instead of facing the uncertainty of the future with vision and courage. And so this is going to hurt us for years and years. The decisions will be made, things will get worse. Now, I don't know whether that's a bad thing or a good thing, that things are going to get worse faster than if we had had wisdom at the leadership level. I don't know, but I think we're going to find that it will be years before we begin to recognize and recover from the political decisions that will be enacted over the next decade under the influence of this election. So I see it as we have choice points in this process. We have choice points of whether to be wise or whether to be dumb. I'm afraid we didn't pass this intelligence choice in our country. So fingers crossed and hands folded. Yeah.
So for me individually, keep a focus on the kind of person I want to be. And is that rather than going into judgment or grief or outrage?
One of the things about reincarnation is that it gives everybody permission to be at the level of spiritual development that they are at. And you kind of lose the habit of judging other people, because you can't judge other people because you don't know what their calling was, what their challenge was. You just don't know. You don't know how old they are. They could be babies. They could be graduate students. You just don't know. So it leads me to be kind of respectfully distant in that way. So my focus is do the best I can, help the people who see what I see, do the best they can. Together, I think we will make a difference. And by the way, I think as we go into hotter and hotter, and I don't mean that temperature-wise, but more and more intense destabilization in the future, the individual can have a significantly greater impact. This we've learned from nonlinear systems and chaos theory. The more intense, the more nonlinear a system, as has been generating instability because it's absorbing more and more energy, it becomes unstable. At those highly energized states, individuals can have a disproportionate impact. Butterfly flaps its wings, a hurricane in China. So there's an interconnection of the web. As we go into this crisis, each individual will have a greater impact than they might have had 100 years ago, because the whole foundation is going to be energized. Victoria, thank you very much. Thank you for your good questions.
Thank you.
Johnny, you're next.
Okay. This has all been wonderful. Everything. I've so enjoyed listening to you, to that whole presentation that you did, and Victoria's questions and your answers and everything. And past lifetimes has been so interesting to me, and I have asked for lifetimes with certain people. I've been wounded, I've been actually killed, I've been, set out to die, all kinds of things. But right now I have been for the last 3 or 4 years preparing myself to write quote memoir, but it's not going to be the usual type of memoir book. It'll be in 3 parts. And the first 56 and a half years, of course, will be the first part. And that'll probably be the least amount, but I have to write that without judgment, without blame, clear, and so on. And so the things that you're saying in terms of what we have to do for ourselves are so, it hits home to me so much. And I'm close to that. And I have been close to that for a while, but I just had to figure it out in my mind, how to say it, how to be it, how to, present it. And the second part is all of the esoteric studies, ancient wisdom techniques, all of that kind of thing, past life stuff and everything. And the third part is going to be now.
Johnny, sorry to interrupt, but do you have a question?
Um, I think I wish I had a question. I can't, I'm working with all the answers right now. And I guess my question would be, I want to make a difference somehow. I feel I can do it with my writing, with the way that I write, the things that I write about. And it's a big, big task. And
Mhm.
I am wondering, how do I
Mhm.
hold that? How do
Yeah.
I keep that focus in
Yeah.
spite of what's going on around us?
Yeah.
She asked the
Boy,
question.
Mhm.
the life of a writer is a different kind of life, isn't it? It's like
Yes.
climb the mountain, close the door, open the windows, but it's a deep inner focus, and you hold that focus for a long time. Honestly, it took me 5 years at the computer to write LSD in the Mind of the Universe. It took me 3 years just to get myself in the position of letting people in as deeply as I was going to let them in. And then it took decades, 20 years, just to gather the experiences which I put into that book. And so it's a very intense process. And I'd encourage you, just trust your calling. Trust your calling. If you feel that writing is your calling, it's your contribution, it's what you can give, then buckle in. Take it as far, take it as deep, bring it as deeply in forward as possible, and then share it with the world. Throw it out there. Let it go, and don't have
Yeah.
any attachment to the results. You do the best you can. You let it go where it will go, and that's a
I
great
set,
gift. That's a great gift. Yeah.
I set a very high intention. And the other part of that is to not be attached to the outcome. That's the other part of the intention. But I don't have a long time to do this. I'm 83 years old. This is something that I'm doing for
Okay.
a legacy for my family, for one thing, but also I want the world to understand so many things that they're missing right now. And of
Yeah.
course, we just came up with a huge challenge in this election, a huge, huge challenge. So this
Well,
is my way of trying to,
yeah.
address all of that.
Pressure cooker is on. Amazing things come
Yeah.
out of us when the pressure is on, huh? We can
Yes.
trust that. Yeah.
It's an I can do it. I know all of this is happening around me, but I can do this. But I've got to let go of all that other stuff.
Good luck to you. Fingers crossed. Looking forward to seeing what you produce.
Thank you.
Thank
And I
you.
did read your life cycles, but if I had read this stuff sooner, my life would have been totally different. But I don't know that I would have wanted it that way, because part of what I was doing all those 56 and a half years was it, it was my purpose. It was what I had to do to move on.
Thank you, Janae. So our next question is Christopher.
Hmm.
There we go. Thank you,
Yeah.
Donnie.
Because
Tremendous presentation. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's an honor, and I wanted to go on and hear the rest of your lecture as well. And I don't know if you still do in-person events or not, but it would be wonderful. So, moving forward with the question. So, as a child, I was taught that I had sin and therefore I had debt. Later in life, I moved on, more sophisticated, I thought, and then I had karma and again, debt, right? So here we are again. Then, the idea with it, reincarnation and karma became entwined, right? And it was the idea that since you have karma, you have to reincarnate to keep working on this wheel of karma, this reincarnation.
yeah,
So I'd be interested in your thoughts about, is karma really entwined with reincarnation? Certainly, for those who have had the experience of meeting divine presence and source and the incredible love, life becomes an honor, a tremendous honor to be here. So is
yeah,
it, is it acts of honor and giving back, or is reincarnation bound to karma?
yeah,
And the second part of that being, more recently, I've heard people saying our karma is being lessened and going down, and perhaps we're, if that theory is correct, that we're paying that off. And maybe in the future, we're reincarnating because we don't have karma anymore.
Yeah.
So, thoughts?
Mhm.
A lot of questions rolled into those couple of questions.
Yeah.
I think of karma, let me back up. I think karma, cause and effect, is just part of the process. The physical universe has a lot of cause and effects running. The spiritual conscious universe has a lot of cause and effect coming. But the question is how we interpret that cause and effect pattern. And I think we've been kind of interpreting it in too narrow a way for a long time. If you listen to past life therapy, if you read aloud past life therapy, you basically could justifiably come away with the conclusion that life is basically about healing, that we fuck up a lot. We got a lot of fix up to do. And you could kind of have a negative perception of what carries over from the past. There's so much mess up and so much cleanup that's needed. When in fact, I think most people, they pass their karmic test. Most of the kids in the school systems, they graduate, they go to the next level. Most people pass their karmic test. And that means we're bringing into our next life, not just liabilities, we're bringing in assets, we're bringing in skills, we're bringing in relationships that have matured. So but the people who don't go to therapists to celebrate their victories. They go to therapists to heal their wounds. So it's okay, it's perfectly okay, but we just have to remember there's a larger pattern here. And so we have to make sure that the story which emerges is not just a story of healing, but a story of investing in human development, in human growth, challenging ourselves, developing arts, talents, and knowledge, just the enriching of the human spirit. That is certainly the larger share of what's happening in reincarnation than simply these picking over the bones of a grudge here or a grudge there. Now, if you look at religion, I think there's been a similar kind of damping down in that the religions of the last 4,000 years, the axial age, they reflected an intensification of our getting access to spiritual reality. Yoga, meditation, we were just getting deeper and deeper first takes in the spiritual reality. And if you do have a deep experience of spiritual reality, how could you not but think we belong there more than here? Somehow there's been an accident that we got marooned here. The job is to get back to there, right? Christ will come and save me from my sins. I am stuck in the mud. Get me back to there. I'll become enlightened. I'll become awakened. So when I can awake, I can go there, because who wants to be here when you can go there? Okay, I understand that. I feel the compassion in that. But now that we're beginning to understand how big here is, how huge it is, how old it is, that we measure it in light years, in distances of 6 million miles a year in one light year. And we're measuring billions of light years across. And it's so old, it doesn't really make sense to really say, oh yeah. And after all of this evolutionary thrust, just after 5,000 years when we began to be conscious, just as we begin to sink down into that consciousness which we share with all of life, and we discover, oh my God, my life is one with all of life, just then we leave the system and the system has served its purpose? No, I don't think so. At least what came through in my work, and I find so many people affirming it, and that is, it is about incarnating deeper and deeper and deeper, not just patching up our history, but incarnating the power of spirit, incarnating heaven into our physical bodies, heaven into our social relationships. It's about giving birth to this deeper consciousness inside our incarnations. I think we're giving birth so that the ego, beautiful thing as it is, the consciousness that holds our lifetime, is giving birth to the soul consciousness in the body, the diamond soul, the consciousness that holds all of our lifetimes, not as fragments, but unified as one, fused in one, when all of our lifetimes, all those thousands of years come together and fuse into a singularity, it gives birth to a consciousness that is more than just an enlightened consciousness. It gives birth to a magnitude of consciousness which is different. It's 100,000-year-old consciousness. And that is becoming the new operational consciousness of humanity. To get there, we have to let go of all the divisions that we've invoked, all the racism, all the political divisions, all the national divisions, all the class divisions, all that stuff which we've kept used to keep separate from each other. This has got to, we got to sweat that stuff out of our pores. We have to sweat it out. And I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know how many generations, but it is a multi-generational task, isn't it? It's a multi-generational task where somewhere along the way, we go through gradually, probably, a transformation where we do something like the mystics do. We go through a death and rebirth. We go through a complete collapse, a surrender to forces beyond our control. We let go of self-interest. We begin to take on into our hearts the needs of other beings. In this crisis where we will all become refugees in one way or another, the human heart, I think, is going to be opened, purified, touched. And the human heart that emerges from this time in history is going to be massive, beautiful, ecstatic, enlightened, prophetic, Christ consciousness, Buddha consciousness, prophet consciousness, different order of time. And I think all of us knew what we were getting into when we chose to incarnate in this part of the century. We chose to be part of it. We chose to align ourselves with this historical movement, not just for our own benefit. It speeds up our evolution, but it also helps our children, helps our grandchildren through this. We're all in this together. So I think karma is part of the web work, but here's another thing. Those, when we are privileged to touch the infinite is like Ali Ali income free. Infinite is like infinite joy, no judgment, infinite capacity to transform karma and wrap it up and throw it away. So there's, on the one hand, we learn, we have to learn. On the other hand, we can learn and let go much faster than we think we can. We let go of these old, stupid, narrow concepts of God, which keep us so imprisoned in our fear and uncertainty. Let that go. I think this is an extraordinary, powerful time. And I do think you're right. Yeah, I'll tell you, Robert Monroe, his book, Monroe is the Monroe Institute, his book, Far Journeys, he was taken into the future. He thinks somewhere around mid 3000 something AD. And in that future, when he looked up and saw the bardo, there was no bardo anymore. There were no souls in the intermediate state. It was physical reality, purely open into the luminosity of diamond light. And I think what that it teaches us is that the bardo are lives that are unresolved, unfinished, and it's individual, but also collective. I think we are processing our former lives. We're processing our karma. We're growing up. We're facing ourselves in history. And when that happens, we will be much more transparent to the divine intelligence, to the divine love, to the divine information that can help us when we have this kind of access. There'll be no technical problem that we can't solve. There'll be no social problem that we can't heal, can't solve. Right? That's what I think we're working towards. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for the great question, Christopher. Yeah.
Beautiful answer. So Janine, you're the next questioner.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. Let's see. I guess maybe if I put it on gallery, then I won't feel strange.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually like, I have so much in my thoughts right now, that I'm gonna try to connect to them. One is, I said to a friend who used to not have like spiritual expansive connections, and then her husband died, and then, she had experiences, and she had sort of judged me before from my experiences, and what popped out of my mouth is one person's experience is another person's woo-woo.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Mhm.
I think that's important to me because I find myself like not wanting to prove anything to anybody just because I come from a different world, right? Um, but simply to experience
Mm.
and share when that feels appropriate. And wow, that last response, one of the things it reminded me of was having a soul retrieval at a time that I was like at the lowest time in my life and just completely overwhelmed and really having a hard time functioning. And in the 2-day process, I went from being in that state to so expansive, so joyful, so much ease. And so when you're talking about where we're going, I'm like, I,
Yeah.
I'm not going to assume that we know how it's going to go, and it may be very different for different people. But things can happen really fast.
Yeah.
So Janine, do you have a question?
Um, yeah, I guess I guess I was saying these things to hear responses to them, but one
Well,
question, yeah, go ahead,
can respond,
please.
and that is, I think you're very much right. Soul retrieval and what's happening in an historical situation is very similar. In soul retrieval, we retrieve alienated, split off portions of our soul. And to do that, we have to heal those portions and integrate them, welcome them back into the unity. I think the same thing is happening in our historical process too. We are retrieving our souls during the whole period of history when we thought we were egos and we made decisions based on our private, separate existence. Now we have to retrieve all those pieces of injured and what we did to other people so that we can now grow into a full manifesting soul. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Other quick question, and thank you so much. Appreciate that. Um, I'm curious whether you've looked at the work of Nassim Haramein, the unified field physicist, because I think there's some alignment, different worlds, yet some real connections.
Sounds like it, doesn't it? I mean, unified theory, I'm all up for unified theory. But here's one of the advantages of being retired and getting old is I don't have to keep up with the literature anymore. So I admit I'm really behind on, the literature as such, but Irvin Laszlo's work, Akashic field theory, chaos theory, the work in fields. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fertile ground.
Great. Thank you so much for all that you're sharing with us. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Oops, Norma, you're up next. What's your question?
Nadia, I don't exactly have a question, but I I have been studying myself getting old, and I'm going through a process, and I'm losing my identity. I'm not who I was. Each decade, I'm a different person, and now I'm losing my identity, and I realize I've been an ego,
Mhm.
and my ego was all that identity.
Yeah.
And now, and also what you said, oh, then I said, where do people? I
Mhm.
think I'm headed maybe toward peoplelessness.
Mm.
People, and I'm wondering, oh, maybe this is a question.
Yeah.
Because what I saw when you were describing the golden something is
Mhm.
dust,
Mhm.
and the possibility that humans, that I will not be human, but I will be dust, dust to dust and dust to dust, or whatever it is.
Yeah,
So that is kind of bringing that
yeah.
out. And I do appreciate uh, dropping in and getting excited about more information. So I'll go to the library and find you.
Well, you know, Nora, your experience of getting lighter and lighter and kind of disappearing, that speaks to me. That's my experience too. I find that the older I get, and I'm 75 now, so you may have a couple years on me, but I'm right behind you. The thinner my arms get and the weaker my skeleton gets, it's like it's falling off. It gets soft and it's falling off. And as it falls off, the memories associated with get loose and they can fall off. And I find it much easier to move into egoless places than I used to, just because my skin is wrapped a little loose, you know, my mind. And I think we get older, it gets easier to step into that in-between place. And that's just kind of, and it just, when we get to the very end, it's a big release and we go light to light.
Light. That's what I'm feeling too, is I'm getting lighter. You know, everything is getting lighter. And I'm excited about the last breath. I'm hoping I can be conscious
Yeah.
with my last breath.
You know, all my life, I've been telling my children when they're every little bitty kids, I said, it's a great life. And in the end, you get to die. Death is something to look forward to. Death is graduation. Death is coming home. If there were one thing I wish I could give to people, it's give up your fear of death. If you have a fear of death, you've got your entire metaphysics upside down. Birth is when the hard stuff begins. You should mourn the child. They're beginning first grade. Death is graduation. Death is joy and celebration. All of our mythology that makes death hard, difficult, ghosty, nonsense. 99.9% of the people, it's a spontaneous into the arms of the divine rushing home. And so if you're clear, I mean, if you're really clear on what birth is and what death is, then death is something you take into your heart and celebrate. This is a life coming to fruition. You're bringing your soul and everything you've learned back to your core soul. You're bringing all of your decisions back to your core soul. And that's like, wow, that's
It
graduation.
may not be joy and sorrow. It may not be joy and sorrow. It may be something whole.
Yeah, bigger than that, bigger than
Bigger.
joy and sorrow.
Yeah.
Whole. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Norma. I guess it's my turn because Paul here has a question.
My question was, from, as you've talked about, and you've talked about the word reincarnation.
Yeah.
Is reincarnation, from your perspective, strictly related to humanity on Earth? Or does it serve a different role or a greater role in the broader universe?
Yeah, yeah, good question. And you know, in my writing, you know that my work really focuses on human consciousness. And people have asked me, how come you don't get really deep into animal consciousness and plant consciousness like a lot of other shamans and whatnot? And that's a really good question, because I know there are fields of consciousness related to plant kingdoms and animal kingdoms. And I think the reason is because for me, humanity represents the greatest threat to all life on the planet. And so my work has been really trying to work with human consciousness in the belief that if we can heal humanity, all the other forms of life will be safer, will be safe from us.
Interesting.
Now, the cultures that believe in reincarnation, they all tend to agree on one thing. It doesn't begin with human beings. So they all look to higher mammalian forms, higher life forms among the animal kingdoms as a bridge over into human consciousness. So there's a sense of learning the basics. So my sense of it is individuality is the seed kernel that makes reincarnation possible. So I don't look at a field of grass and say, there's 10,000 individuals there. They all pretty much, it's a collective identity. Somewhere along the way, these complex collective identities give birth to more and more individual awareness, self-awareness in it. My dog, I tend to think that my dog's pretty individuated, you know? So somewhere along the way, reincarnation begins as a learning, a following, a learning and following, and it begins before human beings, I think. But nobody knows exactly where, and nobody knows exactly how. But it's just an organic, natural developmental process from humans. And I also think once you come to certain thresholds, there's not much point in incarnating at a lower level. General rule of thumb, once you can function as a human being, not much point in functioning coming back as a dog, because you're at a quantum jump higher. Now that's, I don't want to make rigid rules here, but basically it's kind of like college. Once you can do calculus, we will not give you a course to go back and take a course in algebra, because calculus assumes a knowledge of algebra. You can do it if you want, but we won't give you credit for it. And I think it's like that with incarnation. We sort of go through certain developmental stages, and once you can function at that stage, then naturally you want to function at that stage and higher. That stage and higher. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more question related to that is, of all the books I've read on reincarnation and past lives, I've not seen one where there was a reincarnation from or to another planet or star system. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I'd say why not? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like once you understand that the dynamic principles of evolution are carrying themselves out, playing themselves out in other solar systems, in other galaxies, and you run the numbers, it's kind of like there's got to be, there's got to be intelligent life out there. And if we can incarnate, then they can incarnate, and distance is immaterial. And there are some people who have conscious recall of having been a life form in another planet. And I can't remember her name, but there's a woman who does past life therapy, and this is her major focus, helping people who integrate incarnations which are aware from another lifetime. So if you do a little digging around, and I'm sorry, I just can't remember her name at present. So I just say, sure, why not? I personally don't have conscious recall of such, though I will say I was at a spiritual workshop, met a person there, one of the teachers there, and he had recall of he and I and one other person there in another planetary system in another incarnation. So I'd say, okay, why not?
Why not? Great. So we have time for one last question. If anyone, unless you would like to have a last say, Chris?
Well, let me just maybe draw some things together, and let's.
Great.
Clearly, reincarnation doesn't end all the questions. To me, reincarnation just begins a whole rich vein of questions. It opens up possibilities because it relieves us from the terrible burden of time. Now, when we ask ourselves, what do we want to be? What do we want to become? We should be thinking in terms of 10,000-year increments, not 100-year increments. Do you want to become Beethoven? Do you want to become a Mozart? Do you want to become a great poet, a great artist? Now we have unlimited time. The universe wants us to develop all the talents that are latent within this human form. So, and the diamond soul is going to function at a much, much higher level of sensory experience. Vision, much more refined, intense, clarified, all the physical senses. It's not just an open heart, it's not just an open mind, but the entire physical body animated into higher orders of self-realization. The divine is shoving together kind of, I think of it as green reality, earth, and then light, pure light, spiritual reality. And we're just forging more and more and more and more into each other until we become green spiritual beings filled with light, radiating with light. It's going to take time, but the pace is picking up. And I think when the child is born, when we succeed in bringing this new awakened consciousness, transformed consciousness into the world, like every mother, they will look at that child and we will say, it was worth it. It was worth it to give birth to this magnificent being, this Christ child, this Buddha awakened child to humanity, not just here and there, not just for some special people here and there, for all of humanity, everywhere. And boy, don't you know the women have to, I think the women are the key to getting us through this crisis. Men have had their chance. We have screwed it up. We've had our chance. Women have to exercise a greater and greater share of power to reclaim the power that they've been denied, to bring it fully forward. And any man worth his salt will be so glad when that happens, because we'll know that half of us is now showing up fully, and we are stronger when we're all together. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's basically the message of reincarnation. We are constantly growing deeper community, not just deeper individuals. We're growing deeper community. We have blended all the races in our body. We've blended all the different cultures, all the different religions in our body. They're all here. We are the living consciousness that incorporates the future human, which is transnational, transracial, transreligious. There's so many false identities which are going to fall away quickly as we make this. And as we make this transition, here's one of the sweet things, my last thought to share with you. We're going to find that 99% of the work has already been done. We are just waking up. The fetus isn't gestated in the day of labor. Labor's been long. Most of the work has already been done. It's just the last bit, the last waking up, the last time around, opening up and letting this birth take place. I think this is the century. It'll happen this century. It has to. We don't have time. We do not have time. Yeah. Thank you very much for giving it such a big slice of your day and having this time for us to spend together. Really, it's such a wonderful experience to know, and I hope that you take the work and take it out among your friends and share the book, share the work. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was fabulous. I'm going to put it on gallery view, and if you want to unmute yourself and say goodbye to Chris and everyone else, thank you all for coming. This has been fabulous. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Dottie.
Have a beautiful rest of your day.
Yeah.
Chris, I have one question. Can you say your last name?
Bache.
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 Thank you.
Okay.
All right,
Bye,
lots of love,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Chris.